Oh, wonderful. Just absolutely wonderful. Here I am, Professor Keth'ran of the prestigious Galactic Military Academy, and what do I get to observe today? Humans. Actual, breathing, primitive humans sitting in my advanced tactical warfare classroom like they belong here. The Galactic Council, in their infinite wisdom, decided that these barely evolved primates needed to be included in our exchange program. Because apparently, diversity matters more than competence these days. I adjusted my optical sensors and scanned the motley crew that Earth had so graciously bestowed upon us. 4 specimens of humanity, sitting there with their ridiculously symmetrical faces and their laughably simple bone structure. The Academy administrators assured me these were their best and brightest. Right, and I'm a Plutonian swamp dancer. Let me paint you a picture of what I was dealing with here. In the front row, we had Marcus Thompson. Now this one, even a blind Centaurian could spot as trouble. The human was built like a cargo hauler, muscles rippling under his academy uniform like he'd been assembled in some sort of biological weapons factory. His jaw was square enough to use as a construction tool, and he kept flexing his hands like he was calculating how many of us he could strangle before lunch. Classic human brutality, wrapped up in a pretty package. The Academy security protocols had already flagged him as a potential physical threat. How original. 2 seats over sat Luna Mitchell, and, oh, this one thought she was clever. Her fingers danced across her datapad like she was conducting some sort of digital symphony, eyes darting between screens faster than a Rigelian hummingbird on stimulants. The tech department had already caught her attempting to optimize our security systems within her first hour on station. Because nothing says peaceful student exchange like immediately trying to hack into classified military networks. Her file was thick with academic achievements in cybernetics and artificial intelligence. Another obvious danger, cataloged and filed away by our threat assessment teams. Then there was Jake Morrison, sitting in the back row like he owned the place. This one didn't even try to hide his aggressive nature. He'd already gotten into 3 verbal altercations with other students, challenged our combat instructor to a friendly sparring match, and somehow managed to turn lunch period into what could only be described as a food-based territorial dispute. His voice carried across the classroom like a foghorn, every comment dripping with that distinctly human brand of arrogance that makes you want to jettison them out the nearest airlock. The disciplinary committee had a betting pool on how long it would take him to start an actual fight. And then there was the one in row 3, Zoe Parker, sitting there like a lump of processed nutrients, staring at her notes with all the intensity of someone reading a grocery list. Brown hair pulled back in the most boring configuration possible, clothes that screamed "please don't notice me," and a posture that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. She hadn't spoken a word since arriving, barely made eye contact with anyone, and seemed to jump slightly every time someone addressed her directly. Her academic records were adequate. Just adequate. No standout achievements, no red flags, no particular talents worth mentioning. She'd scored precisely average on every single placement test. In other words, completely harmless. The Academy's threat assessment AI had ranked her as negligible concern, and honestly, I couldn't argue with that analysis. While her fellow humans were busy being obviously dangerous in their primitive ways, little Zoe Parker sat there being magnificently unremarkable. She was the kind of student you forgot was even in the room until attendance time. Which is exactly why I focused my attention on the real threats. Marcus with his physical capabilities, Luna with her technical skills, and Jake with his confrontational nature. These were the humans we needed to watch, the ones who could cause actual problems if they decided to embrace their species' legendary unpredictability. The quiet one in row 3? She was just along for the ride, probably wondering how she'd even qualified for this program in the first place. Oh, how wrong I was about to be. The next morning brought our first combat simulation class, and I have to admit, I was practically vibrating with anticipation. Commander Vorth had designed what he called a gentle introduction to our training protocols. Translation: let's see how badly these humans embarrass themselves when faced with actual military scenarios. The simulation chamber hummed to life, holographic enemies materializing in a standard urban warfare environment. Captain Nexus stood at the observation deck, his tentacles practically twitching with amusement as he watched our human guests fumble with their equipment. "This should be educational," he whispered to me, mandibles clicking in what passed for laughter among his species. And oh, were we ever educated. Marcus Thompson exploded into action like some sort of biological missile. The human launched himself over barriers that would challenge most of our cadets, rolled through cover with impossible grace, and somehow managed to eliminate 6 holographic enemies before our own students had even finished analyzing the tactical situation. His movements were fluid, efficient, and absolutely terrifying in their precision. Our Zephyrian combat instructors nodded knowingly at each other. "Typical human physicality," they murmured. "All muscle, no strategy." Meanwhile, Luna Mitchell had somehow sweet-talked her way into the simulation's control room. Within minutes, she'd identified 3 separate vulnerabilities in our impenetrable security protocols and was casually rerouting enemy patrol patterns like she was redecorating her living quarters. The holographic opposition started walking in circles, their AI completely scrambled by her interference. Our tech specialists watched in horror as she turned their carefully crafted training scenario into what looked like a comedy routine. Classic human technical obsession, they grumbled. They can't help but tinker with everything. Jake Morrison, predictably, chose the direct approach. He grabbed the largest weapon available and charged straight into enemy territory, shouting what I can only assume were human battle cries. The simulation registered 17 enemy eliminations in under 3 minutes, though I suspect most of them died from sheer bewilderment rather than actual tactical superiority. His approach had all the subtlety of a meteor impact, but it was undeniably effective. Brute force mentality, the instructors noted with satisfaction. Exactly what we expected from their species. And then there was Zoe Parker. She stumbled through the simulation like someone who'd never seen a weapon before, which, given her background, was entirely possible. Her shots missed more often than they hit. She got lost twice in the clearly marked training environment, and at one point she actually walked into a wall that was quite obviously there. Her final score was a solid C-, which honestly seemed generous considering her performance. "See?" Commander Vorth gestured at the scoring display with obvious satisfaction. "Humans are completely predictable. Physical prowess, technical cleverness, aggressive tactics, and," he paused at Zoe's results, "complete incompetence. Their military capabilities follow exactly the patterns our xenobiologist predicted." The other instructors nodded sagely. Captain Nexus pulled up detailed analyses of each human's performance, pointing out how their behaviors matched pre-established psychological profiles. "The female specimen in row 3 is clearly the weak link," he observed. "Probably included in the program for political correctness rather than actual capability." During lunch break, I had the opportunity to observe their social behaviors, and let me tell you, it was like watching a nature documentary about particularly strange animals. Marcus consumed enough protein to fuel a small transport vessel, methodically working through his meal like he was refueling machinery. Luna barely ate at all, too busy taking apart her utensils to see how they worked. Jake treated the dining hall like his personal comedy stage, regaling anyone within earshot with increasingly improbable stories about Earth military exploits. And Zoe? She sat alone, picking at her food and occasionally glancing around nervously like she expected someone to tell her she didn't belong there. Which, honestly, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Our Andromedan psychology students were having a field day analyzing them. "The human pack structure is fascinating," one observed. 3 alphas and 1 obvious omega. The weak one will likely be abandoned if the group faces serious pressure. By the end of the first week, we had them completely figured out. 3 obvious threats operating exactly according to their species' documented behavioral patterns, and 1 harmless tag-along who probably wouldn't survive the first serious challenge. The Academy's confidence was at an all-time high. We knew exactly what we were dealing with, and more importantly, we knew exactly how to handle it. If only we'd been paying attention to the right things. 3 weeks into the exchange program, Commander Vorth had what he considered a brilliant idea. And when I say brilliant, I mean the kind of idea that makes you wonder if someone's been breathing too much recycled atmosphere. "We need to humble them," he announced during our weekly faculty meeting, his scales practically glowing with excitement. "These humans are getting too comfortable. They think their primitive tactics actually work against superior opponents." Captain Nexus nodded enthusiastically, his tentacles writhing in agreement. A full-scale war game simulation. 3 days of intensive strategic combat. We'll pit them against our elite Zephyrian strike teams. I nearly choked on my stimulant beverage. The elite Zephyrian strike teams? These were the Academy's crown jewel, composed of the most tactically advanced students from across 12 different star systems. They'd never lost a simulation. Ever. Their coordination was legendary, their technology was cutting edge, and their strategic thinking was so sophisticated that most junior instructors couldn't even follow their battle plans. Isn't that a bit, I searched for the diplomatic term, excessive? Commander Vorth's laugh was like grinding metal. Excessive? Professor Keth'ran, these humans need to understand their place in the galactic hierarchy. They've been far too confident lately. A proper defeat will teach them humility and give us valuable data about their species' limitations under pressure. The other faculty members were practically rubbing their appendages together with glee. This wasn't just going to be an educational exercise, it was going to be a complete demolition of human military capabilities. The kind of thorough humiliation that would be talked about in academy circles for decades. The simulation parameters were, frankly, absurd. The humans would be given standard academy equipment and placed in a hostile environment with limited resources. The elite Zephyrian strike teams would have access to advanced reconnaissance, superior firepower, and tactical support systems that could coordinate across multiple battlefronts simultaneously. It was like watching someone arrange a fight between a pack of domesticated animals and a squadron of professional hunters. The exercise will run for 72 hours, Captain Nexus explained to the assembled students. Complete tactical warfare scenario. The humans will attempt to hold strategic positions while our elite strike teams demonstrate proper military methodology. Marcus Thompson cracked his knuckles with that disturbing human habit of making their joints pop. Luna Mitchell was already analyzing the equipment specifications on her datapad. Jake Morrison was grinning like he'd just been invited to his favorite kind of party. And Zoe Parker? She looked like she was about to be sick. The first day went exactly as predicted. The elite strike teams moved with mechanical precision, their formations flawless, their communications seamless. They established perimeter control within the first hour, secured high ground positions by hour 2, and had effectively surrounded the human positions before lunch break. Our human specimens fought valiantly, I'll give them that. Marcus used his physical advantages to excellent effect, holding defensive positions that should have been impossible to maintain. Luna managed to jury-rig several pieces of equipment into configurations that weren't in any manual, creating temporary advantages through sheer technical creativity. Jake's aggressive tactics caught the strike teams off guard multiple times, his unpredictable assaults disrupting their careful formations. But they were losing. Badly. By the end of day 1, the humans had been pushed back to their final defensive positions. Their supply lines were cut, their communication was sporadic, and their tactical options were dwindling rapidly. The elite strike teams controlled 70% of the battlefield and were methodically tightening their grip on the remaining contested areas. Predictable, Commander Vorth observed with satisfaction. Human tactics are effective against primitive opponents, but they simply can't match sophisticated strategic thinking. The faculty observation deck was filled with knowing nods and satisfied murmurs. Several instructors had already begun drafting reports about human military limitations for submission to the Galactic Strategic Council. And Zoe? Poor little Zoe Parker was having what could charitably be described as a complete breakdown. She'd been assigned to communications and logistics, probably the safest possible position, and she was failing spectacularly even at that. Her radio protocols were all wrong, her supply coordination was chaotic, and she seemed to spend most of her time staring at status reports with a glazed expression that suggested complete cognitive overload. "The weak one isn't even contributing," Captain Nexus noted with clinical detachment. "She's actually hindering their efforts. If they had any tactical sense, they would have removed her from active duty by now." Day 2 brought more of the same. The strike teams continued their methodical advance, demonstrating textbook examples of combined arms tactics and coordinated assault strategies. The humans fought desperately, but they were clearly outmatched by superior training, better equipment, and more sophisticated strategic thinking. Their final defeat was just a matter of time, and everyone knew it. The Academy's confidence had reached stratospheric levels. Not only were we proving human military inferiority, we were doing it with such thoroughness that there could be no possible argument about the results. This was going to be the definitive demonstration of why humans needed to know their place in the galactic order. What could possibly go wrong? Day 2 started exactly as expected. The elite Saphirian strike teams resumed their methodical advance, their tactical displays showing complete battlefield dominance. Commander Vorth was practically purring with satisfaction as he watched the human positions crumble under sustained pressure. Victory was so certain that several instructors had already started planning their post-simulation analysis presentations. Then things started getting weird. It began with small incidents. Nothing dramatic, just minor technical hiccups that seemed completely random. Strike Team Alpha reported that their primary reconnaissance drone had suffered a navigational malfunction and flown directly into a tree. Not exactly catastrophic, but odd enough to raise eyebrows since these drones had fault-tolerance systems that made such accidents virtually impossible. Equipment failure, Captain Nexus muttered, making notes on his datapad. Even our best technology has statistical failure rates. An hour later, Strike Team Beta's communication array started producing what could only be described as feedback loops. Instead of clear tactical updates, their transmissions became garbled messes of static and overlapping voices. The tech support team spent 20 minutes diagnosing the problem before concluding it was a rare harmonic interference pattern caused by atmospheric conditions. "Unfortunate timing," Commander Vorth observed, though I noticed his scales had lost some of their earlier luster. "But our teams are trained to adapt to communication difficulties." By midday, the incidents were becoming harder to dismiss. Strike Team Gamma's supply drop landed 3 kilometers off target due to what the logistics AI described as a computational error in trajectory calculations. Their backup supplies were delayed when the transport vehicle's guidance system began routing it in circles around the same hill for 45 minutes. The Strike Team Delta discovered that their advanced targeting systems had somehow been recalibrated to metric measurements that didn't exist in any known system. Their weapons were aiming at coordinates that weren't actually there, resulting in a series of spectacularly missed shots that would have been hilarious if they weren't so inexplicable. "This is highly irregular," Captain Nexus admitted, his tentacles twitching with growing concern. "Multiple simultaneous system failures across different platforms suggest." "Suggest what?" Commander Vorth snapped, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I'm not sure. Statistical analysis indicates these failures should be virtually impossible." Meanwhile, on the human side of the battlefield, things were getting equally strange, but in the opposite direction. Marcus Thompson was fighting with the same brutal efficiency as before, but somehow his defensive positions were becoming more effective as the day progressed. Supply drops that should have been intercepted were reaching him without interference. Enemy forces that should have flanked his positions kept getting delayed by equipment malfunctions at exactly the right moments. Luna Mitchell was performing technical miracles that defied explanation. Every time the strike teams adapted their electronic warfare tactics, she seemed to anticipate their moves perfectly. Her improvised countermeasures were working far better than they had any right to, almost like she knew exactly what the enemy was going to do before they did it. Jake Morrison's aggressive tactics were becoming downright supernatural in their effectiveness. His seemingly random assaults kept hitting strike team positions at precisely the moments when their defensive systems were experiencing technical difficulties. His timing was so perfect it bordered on precognitive. And then there was Zoe Parker, still sitting in her little communications bunker, still looking overwhelmed and confused, and still making what appeared to be catastrophic errors in protocol and procedure. The incompetent one is actually getting worse, I observed, watching her fumble with her equipment. She'd somehow managed to broadcast a supply request on 17 different frequencies simultaneously, creating interference patterns that disrupted communications across the entire battlefield. She's not just failing, she's actively sabotaging her own team's efforts. But here's the thing that was starting to gnaw at the edge of my consciousness. Every one of Zoe's mistakes seemed to coincide perfectly with the strike team's technical problems. When she broadcasted on those 17 frequencies, Strike Team Alpha's communication array went down for maintenance. When she misrouted supply coordinates, Strike Team Beta's targeting systems malfunctioned. But when she accidentally triggered a false alarm in the human base's defense grid, Strike Team Gamma's reconnaissance drones all decided to take a scenic tour of the countryside. Correlation doesn't imply causation, Commander Vorth kept repeating, but his voice was getting tighter with each incident. These are separate systems. There's no possible connection between a human's communication errors and our military-grade equipment failures. By late afternoon, the strike teams were experiencing what could only be described as a cascade of technological disasters. Their advanced coordination systems were producing tactical recommendations that made no strategic sense. Their supply chains were delivering the wrong equipment to the wrong locations at the wrong times. Their reconnaissance data was becoming increasingly unreliable, showing enemy positions that didn't exist and missing ones that did. Perhaps we should consider postponing the exercise, Captain Nexus suggested quietly. These technical difficulties are compromising the educational value of the simulation. Absolutely not, Commander Vorth declared, though sweat was beginning to bead on his scaled forehead. We will not let a series of coincidental malfunctions prevent us from completing this demonstration. Our strike teams are professionals. They can adapt to equipment failures. But as the day wore on, it became increasingly clear that adaptation wasn't the problem. The strike teams were adapting beautifully to each new challenge. The problem was that new challenges kept appearing faster than they could be addressed, almost like someone was orchestrating the entire sequence of failures. Someone who understood exactly how their systems worked. Someone who knew precisely when and how to introduce problems that would create maximum disruption with minimum detectability. Someone who was sitting quietly in row 3, looking absolutely terrified while somehow managing to be in the right place at exactly the right time to cause maximum confusion with her apparently innocent mistakes. But that was impossible, right? As night fell on day 2, I found myself staring at Zoe Parker's performance metrics, trying to make sense of patterns that shouldn't exist. Her errors were too perfectly timed, too precisely calibrated to cause maximum disruption. No one could be that accidentally effective at sabotage. Could they? Day 3 began with what can only be described as the complete and utter collapse of everything we thought we knew about warfare, tactics, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. The elite Zephyrian strike teams, those paragons of military excellence, those unstoppable forces of coordinated destruction, fell apart like a house of cards in a hurricane. And I don't mean they were defeated in honorable combat. I mean they disintegrated in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. It started at precisely 0600 hours when all 4 strike teams simultaneously experienced what their commanders described as total system integration failure. Their communication networks didn't just malfunction, they began broadcasting each other's tactical plans to the human forces. Their supply chains didn't just get disrupted, they started delivering ammunition to the enemy positions. Their reconnaissance drones didn't just crash, they began providing real-time surveillance data directly to human command centers. "This is impossible," Commander Vorth stammered, his scales now a sickly yellow color that I'd never seen before. "These are isolated systems. They can't all fail in coordinated patterns." But they weren't just failing. They were failing in sequence, like dominoes falling in a carefully planned cascade. Strike Team Alpha's targeting computers would malfunction at exactly the moment Strike Team Beta's communication array went down, creating a gap in coverage that human forces exploited with surgical precision. Strike Team Gamma's supply drop would go astray just as Strike Team Delta's reconnaissance provided faulty intelligence, leaving entire sections of the battlefield completely undefended. The pattern was so obvious, so methodical, so absolutely deliberate that even our most obtuse faculty members were beginning to notice. "Someone is doing this," Captain Nexus whispered, his tentacles trembling with what I recognized as genuine fear. "This isn't equipment failure. This is sabotage. This is warfare." And that's when we all turned to look at the humans. Marcus Thompson was fighting like a man possessed, but his tactics had evolved beyond simple physical prowess. He was moving with perfect timing, appearing at exactly the right locations at precisely the right moments to exploit every gap in Strike Team defenses. Luna Mitchell wasn't just hacking systems anymore, she was conducting them like a symphony, orchestrating failures and malfunctions with the precision of a master artist. Jake Morrison's aggressive assaults had transformed into surgical strikes that hit vulnerable points with impossible accuracy. But it was Zoe Parker who made my blood run cold. She was still sitting in her communications bunker, still looking overwhelmed and terrified, still making what appeared to be catastrophic errors. But now I could see the truth behind those supposedly innocent mistakes. Every fumbled transmission was precisely timed to disrupt enemy coordination. Every misrouted supply request created exactly the right kind of interference at exactly the right moment. Every accidental system activation triggered cascading failures in Strike Team equipment. "She's not incompetent," I breathed, the realization hitting me like a meteor impact. "She's running the entire operation." Commander Vorth stared at me like I'd just declared myself a Plutonian swamp dancer. "The weak one. Don't be ridiculous. She can barely operate basic equipment." But as I watched her work, I began to see the true scope of what had been happening. This hadn't started on day 3. This hadn't even started on day 2. This had been planned from the very beginning, from the moment these humans walked into our academy. Zoe Parker hadn't been failing at communications and logistics. She'd been studying our systems, learning our protocols, mapping our networks, and identifying every single vulnerability in our military infrastructure. Her mistakes in training had been reconnaissance missions. Her poor performance scores had been camouflage. Her nervous, overwhelmed demeanor had been the most sophisticated act of deception I'd ever witnessed. The other humans hadn't been fighting their own individual battles. They'd been following her strategic direction, executing a coordinated campaign designed to exploit our greatest weakness, our absolute certainty that we were superior. She'd used our arrogance against us. Every dismissive comment, every condescending analysis, every smug assumption about human limitations had been carefully catalogued and turned into a weapon. We'd been so busy watching the obvious threats that we'd completely ignored the real danger sitting quietly in row 3. "Access her personal files," I ordered, my voice barely above a whisper. The Academy's database revealed what should have been obvious from the start. Zoe Parker wasn't a random student selected for cultural exchange. She was a military strategist specializing in asymmetric warfare with advanced degrees in psychological operations and systems analysis. Her area of expertise was defeating technologically superior opponents through misdirection, deception, and exploitation of cognitive bias. She was exactly the kind of person you'd send to infiltrate an arrogant alien military academy and demonstrate that humans were far more dangerous than anyone suspected. The obvious threats had been her smokescreen. Marcus, Luna, and Jake had played their roles perfectly, drawing all attention while the real weapon operated invisibly in the background. As the simulation ended with the complete surrender of all strike teams, Zoe Parker finally looked up from her equipment. For just a moment, her nervous mask slipped, and I saw something that made my scales freeze solid. She smiled. Yep. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a relieved smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just finished playing with her food. We'd been completely, thoroughly, and systematically destroyed by a human we'd dismissed as harmless. And the terrifying thing was, I suspected this was exactly what she'd wanted us to learn. The post-simulation debriefing was, without question, the most uncomfortable hour of my entire academic career. And considering I once had to explain to the Galactic Council why my students accidentally started a small war during a diplomatic training exercise, that's saying something. Commander Vorth sat at the head of the conference table, his scales now a color that didn't exist in any known spectrum, staring at the tactical analysis reports like they were written in a dead language. Captain Nexus had retreated so far into his shell that only his eyes were visible, blinking occasionally in what I assumed was existential horror. The other faculty members weren't handling things much better. Professor Keth'ran from the strategy department kept muttering about impossible variables and unquantifiable human factors. The psychology instructors were frantically rewriting their entire curriculum on human behavioral patterns. The technology specialists were questioning whether our equipment had been secretly sentient all along and had chosen this moment to rebel against its creators. And then there was Zoe Parker, sitting across from us with that same quiet demeanor that had fooled us so completely, waiting patiently for someone to ask the obvious question. How? Commander Vorth finally managed, his voice cracking like a teenage cadet's. Zoe leaned forward slightly, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and absolutely nothing like the nervous whisper we'd been hearing for weeks. You assumed that superior technology automatically meant superior strategy. You confused tactical excellence with strategic thinking. And most importantly, you let your arrogance blind you to threats that didn't fit your preconceptions. She gestured to a holographic display showing the simulation timeline. Every system you used had predictable patterns. Your strike teams followed doctrine so rigidly that their responses became completely foreseeable. Your technology was impressive, but it was designed by minds that thought in straight lines. But the equipment failures, Captain Nexus protested weakly. The malfunctions were genuine. Our diagnostic systems confirmed it. Of course they were genuine, Zoe replied with what I can only describe as terrifying patience. I didn't hack your systems directly. I manipulated the environmental factors that your systems used for calibration. A few electromagnetic pulses at precisely the right frequencies, some carefully timed interference patterns, strategic placement of reflective surfaces to confuse your sensors. Your equipment worked exactly as designed. I just changed what it was designed to respond to. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own circulatory system functioning. You spent 3 weeks cataloging our capabilities, she continued, documenting our behavioral patterns, analyzing our tactical preferences. But you never once considered that we might be doing the same thing to you. You saw Marcus as a physical threat, Luna as a technical threat, Jake as an aggressive threat. You saw exactly what we wanted you to see. Commander Vorth made a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so filled with despair. The obvious threats were misdirection. Humans excel at asymmetric warfare, Zoe explained. When we can't match an opponent's technology or numbers, we find other advantages. Psychology, deception, exploitation of cognitive bias. You were so focused on demonstrating your superiority that you forgot to actually be superior. I found myself speaking, though I'm not entirely sure when I decided to do so. How long have you been planning this? That smile appeared again, just for a moment. Since the moment I read about this exchange program. Your academy's reputation for arrogance preceded you. I knew you'd underestimate us. Especially if we gave you obvious threats to focus on. Humans have been dealing with superior opponents for our entire evolutionary history. We've gotten quite good at it. The faculty meeting that followed was a masterpiece of institutional panic. The threat assessment protocols were completely rewritten. The psychology department requested an emergency budget increase to study human deception capabilities. The strategy instructors demanded access to every piece of human military literature ever written. Most importantly, the Academy's confidence in its ability to predict and control primitive species had been shattered so thoroughly that the pieces were still bouncing. We need to reconsider our entire approach to human relations, Commander Vorth announced during an emergency session. If their exchange students can systematically dismantle our best forces using nothing but misdirection and environmental manipulation, what might their actual military be capable of? Captain Nexus, who had finally emerged from his shell, raised a trembling tentacle. Sir, what if the other three weren't misdirection? What if they were all equally dangerous, just in different ways? The room fell silent as that particular horror settled over us. As the weeks passed and our human guests prepared to return to Earth, the Academy's attitude toward them changed dramatically. No longer were they amusing primitives to be tolerated and studied. They were potential threats to be respected and carefully monitored. And Zoe Parker? She went back to sitting quietly in row 3, taking notes and speaking only when spoken to. But now we all knew the truth. The most dangerous human in the galaxy was the one who looked completely harmless. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrifying thought kept recurring. If this was what their students could do, what exactly were we dealing with when it came to their actual military? I decided I really didn't want to find out.